Welcome.
Thank you.
Um,
Hi, everyone.
so I think we'll just start bigger picture and kind of zoom in. So what is a portfolio career?
It's a great question. I have to say, when I came out of university for my undergrad in Toronto, and I'm a pianist for those who don't know, I had no idea what a portfolio career was. And through many years, I discovered this terminology and thought, wow, that makes my everyday life a lot easier to explain. So basically, a portfolio career, it comes from a management and business background, that term. And it started in the 1990s, which is when kind of we started having more um, consulting type of work where people would not be based in one company the whole time and be full-time employed, but rather they would have all these different pockets of work that would come in and out. And so the idea is that a portfolio career means you might have multiple parts to what you do in your career, that they're self-managed, and that some parts might take more time than others at different times. You might have three full-time jobs one day and nothing the following day. Your portfolio can change over time. So, as an example, when I first came out of school, I was playing for three different choirs and working two part-time administration jobs. Now I'm not playing for any choirs, but I'm in a part-time orchestra and still doing admin, but also doing research. So those different pieces within my portfolio change and take on different weights at different times. But generally, the idea is to be able to explain that as a musician or as a composer or in any artistic field, basically, that we do work in multiple capacities at all times. And so that represents better how we can speak to other people, particularly family going home at the holidays who are like, oh, are you still doing those five jobs? Like, no, actually, my career is a portfolio career. And that's what my portfolio consists of is these few things. So personally, I find it a great tool to be able to explain the way that I work because we are potentially abnormal to, the typical full-time employment job that's not self-managed that many other people have. Even working for a singular company, it's quite easy to say, "Oh, I work for Shopify." We don't really have that. So as musicians, we can use that term, and then we can describe what's in our portfolio. I see some people have already even written that here. For instance, I'm a composer and researcher. That's a portfolio career. Or I'm a performer, a teacher, and an administrator. That's a portfolio career. And you can also include things that are not in music within a portfolio career, which I think is important to note. There are many, many people who have jobs outside of music but are a musician. And so they would say, I'm a portfolio career musician, and these are my components. And they might say, I work 10 hours a week for as a translator, and that's part of their portfolio too. So I hope that gives you a better idea. If you have questions about the specific terminology of portfolio careers, we can talk about that. But I think most people will get the gist because it is how we work as musicians. Oh, August, I think you're still
I
muted.
was muted. Yes, it's 2024 and I still do that. Yeah, I was just going to underline that because I think it's interesting because you're putting a term like a very useful encapsulating term on something that our own data demonstrates is almost certainly the reality for the vast, vast, vast majority of composers. I grabbed some stats out of a recent survey we did
Thanks.
um, that seven this was done for composers in 2023, so it's quite recent. A grand total of 7% of respondents earned half their income from composition, which it would imply that 93% of composers are doing stuff other than composing in order to make a living. So I think it's cool to have a overarching term for this. One thing that sort of popped into my mind when I was putting the topic together and some of the questions together is um, sort of how you came into your particular portfolio career. And I ask this because I think I know I speak for myself, and I think I speak for a lot of people in the field. Like when we're like young undergrads and very ambitious, like we have this fantasy that we're just going to like become superstars and make our living either as performers or composers, and we're like we've gone into this field and we're super awesome, and we've done this so that we don't have to go and get real jobs. And there's a that's not real. And I think there's like, at least for me, even there was like obviously I'm working in administration now, there was like a sense of like defeat, not shame, I want to say, but there was a bit of sense of like disappointment and defeat that like, oh, this didn't really work out. I can't support myself doing this. I need to go and like do boring things. And I don't think that's true. And I don't, I learn better than now, but I was curious, like how would you speak to this? Like, how did you come into your particular career? Was it something you were thinking about when you started? Is it something that emerged over time? And then if those feelings resonate with you, like what, and if maybe you've researched this as well, like, can you speak to those sort of deep personal
Absolutely.
emotions? Yeah.
Oh yeah, 100%. So first of all, I think that is probably the most common reaction of anyone coming out of music school is, okay, so what I was taught in school, I can't actually do to make a living. Meaning in undergrad, and this is reflected in my research, if you were to look up, the landing page of McGill or the landing page of the University of Montreal or of University of Toronto or University of Ottawa, University of Ottawa because that's where my PhD is right now. I know that I'm allowed to talk about them. In particular, if you go to the landing page of the performance program, they describe, we're training musicians to be in an orchestral career or a solo performance career. And I think that this is very misleading and the in the narrative that the schools represent those particular careers as. So what I mean by that is, first of all, to get into an orchestra in this day and age is like winning the lottery. We know it's less than 1% of musicians who are working as a full-time orchestral musician. And there are lots of musicians, composers, pianists, who would never, opera singers who would never even be in an orchestra. That's not a job for them anyway. There's no full-time pianist role in that I'm aware of in almost any companies of any kind other than repetitors in opera. And I think there are 3 jobs in total in Canada for that. So the idea that we're training every year, 40 to 50 musicians in each of these schools to come out to be in an orchestra is a fallacy. And then on top of that, that if you don't make it into that, one bassoon position that comes up across all of Canada in 10 years, that you have failed as a musician. And I think that a lot of us do face a very harsh reality check when we leave university, that actually that incubation of every day you play, 4 to 6 hours a day, or you're composing all year for your composition recital, and that's all you're doing the whole time that you're there. That's just not the way that a music career works once you're out of school. That being said, I think that if music schools were to take a step back and change their narrative to be more representative of what people actually do within the music school, outside of perhaps graded classes, it is a pretty good representation of what we do if you think about it. So as an example, as a pianist, when I was in university, I played my solo repertoire, yes, and I was told to focus on that. But I would also, play, if a friend of mine composed a piece, I would go and play it on the new music series that was happening. And if a singer friend of mine at the last minute needed to record something for an audition, I would be their collaborative pianist. And I would also randomly take on, some hours as a person who was helping new students coming in, and I would be paid for 10 hours a week of work doing that as an administrator. And if you zoom out the lens from just those, okay, I'm getting marked, I need to get a mark on my solo recital at the end of the year, but rather focus on that entirety of what you're seeing in music school, I think it is quite representative. And you can start to see how you could build all those pieces into professional aspects of your career. So I would say that the imposter syndrome, the idea of what a musician does, that stereotype is perpetuated by our institutions currently. And I think that we all have the power to change that because, my colleagues who I consider very successful in music, all of them have portfolio careers. Even those that we would say are in an orchestra or have a solo career. A solo career does not mean that you are performing a solo recital every second night and that's where all your income is coming from. So take Angela Hewitt as an example, probably one of the most famous Canadian performing musicians today. She actually runs a music festival, she does all kinds of teaching, and she does her solo performance. So those are 3 main things within her repertoire, within her portfolio career. And if you take another example, of a well-known composer, Januk Gujaratney, if you were to take his portfolio career, I mean, he has a plethora of things that have moved in and out at different values throughout his life. So right now he's teaching at the University of Ottawa, and that's a very big portion of what his portfolio is. But he also is composing. He's also performing. He also gives talks on creativity. And I would say many people would consider him to be exceptionally successful as a musician. So if we take those people that we are looking to within the music school and we zoom out to look at the entirety of their career rather than to just say, oh, they're making it as a performer or oh, they're making it as a composer. And you look at the combination of things they're doing and you see, wait a second, it's not just me that's doing administration and teaching and performing. That's what everyone does at every level of music within our industry. Then I think that we wouldn't have quite so much that feeling of, wait a sec, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, or I guess I'm just not good enough. And I think that that's a very, it's a cliff that we fall off at the end of university because of those narratives. So I think that's something that we need to change. And I do see some schools are starting to make some of those changes to have people come in and talk about, how to make a career, the business of music, and the elements that you 100% have to have, no matter what. Because at the end of the day, even if you're the absolute best person on your instrument in the world, because you practice, whether it's 2 hours or 10 hours a day, you still need your networks. You still need to know how to market yourself. And you will still likely do at least two, three things as a musician. So I think it's mostly about changing that narrative and talking about the reality of what we each do on a daily basis, including emailing in the morning or, sending off those 10 grants and getting only one of them back successfully or none of them in any given year. So I guess I would say I completely commiserate with you. I totally had that feeling coming out of my undergrad and getting into my own portfolio career, to be honest, it just kind of happened. I was finishing my master's degree in Ottawa. I was doing a master's in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership because at the time I thought, I don't know how to make a career as a musician, so I'm going to go and work in social justice because I thought those were the two things that I cared about, music and social justice. And I didn't see how they could combine because I had never had this idea that you could do multiple things at a time. But by the time I was finishing my master's, I was doing just that. I was working in administration with the Ottawa Arts Council and with Ottawa Chamberfest in two small roles. I was playing for two or three choirs, and I was doing research. And so my portfolio career just kind of naturally started that way. And at the time, I definitely thought, oh, I'm not giving 20 recitals in places like Carnegie Hall, so I guess I'm not the pianist that I thought I was going to be. But in retrospect, I was playing 10 or 20 concerts a year in my 20s. I'm now up to 30-ish a year in my 30s. And I'm very happy with that balance mixed with other things. And I would say composers would be similar. If you have one or two great projects that you're excited about creatively that you can work on, if you think about the amount of administration that has to go into that, writing a grant or working with whoever's going to be performing that piece for you, coming up with the concept and actually physically writing it, those are all very different elements that need to be supported. And you probably will have many other elements in your career, in your portfolio that will be going along in tandem at different times with those compositions. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but I do think that we absolutely have this idealist notion of what a musician's career looks like. And the reality of it is that we all do multiple things and we get to form our own version of what success is as a musician, which is kind of great.
Yeah, I think that covers. I mean, we're going to cover more things, but I think that covers like a chunk of it. And it's interesting. I'm going to throw it to Joseph in a second because there's a question in the chat, but it occurred to me it's interesting that you mentioned Danuk because I mean, yes, he's like metrically speaking, he won the Jan Matichek Award this year, which is like primarily defined or determined by royalties. So like there is a subjective element, but it's mostly about like who got the most SOCAN royalties in the past year. And Danuk like by far got the most SOCAN royalties of almost any composer in Canada in the past year. So that's like as an objective measure of success, it doesn't get much more like capitalistic than that. And yet, he is at U of O, he's giving talks, he's traveling around doing different shows and performances. So, even someone like that it's quite indicative that even someone of that level, like you say, like the Angela Hewitts of the world have to do this. Joseph, there's a question.
Yeah, so this question comes from Chris in the chat. Can you tell us a little bit about how you balance all the careers, all the elements of the portfolio, and how do you choose what to focus on at what time? And sometimes feels strange to work the day job and then do like one artistic project and then be like, oh, because of that one artistic project, I'm a musician, but also rent needs to be paid. So how do you balance that?
Um, It's a great question. First of all, how do you choose what to focus on at a time? You don't always have a choice. I will say that sometimes money will dictate what you're going to be doing. I know probably many people on here, and certainly many of my colleagues, um, COVID greatly affected our choices and what we've been able to do, and is still affecting them, to be honest, because arts organizations are struggling and funding is difficult. So I don't know if you always get to choose, but I would say that for me, my portfolio career, what I've tried to do ever since I've realized that that was the kind of career that I was leading, is that I've tried to look at what my ideal portfolio is. Because for me, it is ideal to me to have multiple things. I don't want to only perform and I don't want to only teach and I don't want to only do X. I really like the mix. So for me, I've always tried to say, okay, if this is my ideal portfolio and it's here, and right now, the elements don't exactly align with that. Which elements do I need to be working on a little bit more this year to move more towards my ideal portfolio? So when I say work towards those more, what I might mean is, okay, I would like to be doing more touring with a chamber group. Well, how do I do that? There are a lot of different elements that need to be in place before I can do a tour, right? I have to have the group together. So I talk to my colleagues and I figure out who that group is and if they're interested and if they're going to have the time if we manage to do this. I look into what kind of funding might be able to support us and what the timelines of that are. And then I start writing to people to see, is this project going to be able to be lifted off the ground? And if I do that work today, maybe in 1 year, maybe in 3 years, that part of my portfolio will be able to be more front facing and take up more of my time and perhaps return more money because I've invested those back end elements earlier on. So for a composer, as an example, that might mean talking to a choir and seeing if next season they'd be willing to have you as their composer in residence. And if that's the case, that you might get to have two or three pieces performed. Or if they already have someone that's chosen, then maybe it's for a future season. And so you know that your timeline is going to look a certain way. Or you might be looking at grants that you can write or people you can work with. And those pieces start to kind of dictate a timeline, right? Because if today you're hired to do a movie score and you know that that will take you 3 months to work on, and that's what you want and or need to be doing right now, but that's not what you want to be doing in the long term. Sure, you can take that work for these 3 months, but in the background, what are you working on to move toward the other parts of your portfolio that you want later on? Um, in terms of balance, that is a very, very tough thing. Musicians are always on, and it is very different than many other professions in that way. In my PhD work, I've surveyed and interviewed a number of grads from 2007 up to 2022. And one of the major things that came up over and over again in the interviews was the challenge of work-life balance, particularly as you get into a time where you're thinking about having a family, or if your partner is also a musician or not, how those things affect your home life. So the only thing I can say about balance for me, I really like being quite busy, but I know that I'm getting to a point where I'm too busy when I can't give myself the time to think creatively at all. And that's a very different ceiling for many people. Um, but I do think that you have to know about yourself as a graduate, maybe every 3 or 5 years, evaluate what is the lifestyle I want to have and how much money do I need to support that? And then be realistic about how you achieve those things. So for some people, they might be comfortable making $30,000 a year and living a lifestyle that reflects that. And so they work towards pieces that will make them that income. But for some others, maybe they say my goal is to make 50,000, and I know I can't do that in music alone or in performance alone. So I'm going to seek out something else that will help supplement that. I think you do have to be realistic about how those pieces work together. And just to know that the music industry does not pay as well as some other industries. that can affect the way that you decide to have those pieces. Lastly, the other thing I would say is in terms of focus, I do really believe in looking at what you're currently doing, evaluating if it's what you want to be doing, and projecting towards what you would like to be doing if it's not. Because if you are consistently working very hard, but you're not getting towards whatever it is that you want to be doing, sometimes we need to zoom out and think more long term, right? So as a composer, if you're getting little bits and pieces that you get to compose here and there for like that are actually earning you income, that's great. But if you want to be writing for a symphony, how do you build up to that? Do you need to actually write to and work with a very small community orchestra that might not pay you this year in order to get to write for a larger symphony later on in your career? Or do you need to work with a specific composer or with a specific instrument in order to learn those pieces that will eventually get you to where that is? Sometimes it takes a long time, to work up to those places that you want to be. But I think it's important to do that zoom out every now and then and evaluate yourself, because there is no one else who's going to do that for you or who knows what it is that you want ideally, because we do want different things. There are lots of people who don't want to be teaching. There are lots of people who don't want to be performing. And so if that's currently part of your portfolio and you want that to be gone, then what are you doing to work toward that? Because no one else is going to take it away from you necessarily. I hope that answers some of that question. That was from Chris, I think.
I think it answered his question and possibly negated one of the questions I had planned for later. So I think we may have ticked off the work-life balance issue, which is an important one. I burned most of my days off last year to spend on composing. So I actually you never sometimes end up actually taking any time off, which is another story rather. So I wanted to dive in a bit. This is something I think about a lot. You were sort of talking about the things we do in music school that can be leveraged a little bit in the real world. And I think I wanted to dive in a little bit on this because, again, it's not something we talk about, but I'm reminded of this Instagram meme that was going around recently, which was basically hire a theater kid, because theater kids they're confident and they usually wear many hats and they do different, they have production experience and they're actors and blah, 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 blah. And I think that's actually quite relevant in the music world. And I think we learn more. I mean, you mentioned rejection, grant writing, things like collaboration comes to mind. I think there's a lot of things we learn in music school that we don't realize are actually really applicable in not even in music jobs, in non-music jobs, in office jobs, in corporate jobs, and etc. And I wonder if you could maybe speak to that for a little bit, and then how what some of those skills are and how we can leverage those, whether we're applying to work at Ottawa Chamberfest or whether we're applying to work at Shopify, for example.
100%. I am a very firm believer that musicians work hard to get where they are. A lot of people who are in music have studied an instrument or composition or conducting, or sang since they were a child and have put in very long hours to get where they are, including during university. And I'm not sure that everyone really understands that outside of music school. And I have hired myself many musicians, and I think they are some of the best workers I've ever hired. Because we're natural problem solvers. We know how to work on our own. We tend to be creative. We have had to collaborate with people, whether we want to or not. And sometimes those have been difficult personalities, because in the arts, we do have some people with, quirks and eccentricities. And I would also say that musicians tend to see projects through to the end. And that's not something that necessarily every member of society has had the chance to experience. And what I mean by that is playing a recital or having your composition played for the first time, working towards that for however long it takes, and then seeing it realized, or actually realizing it yourself, can be one of the most stressful, most nerve-wracking, but also most rewarding experiences. And I think that we understand that, working towards something for a long time and then actually doing it, and having that full spectrum experience. There are lots of people who will never have anything like that in their entire life. I have a lot of friends having lived in Ottawa for a long time who work for government. They don't have events. They don't have, they just have workload that is consistent and goes on. And it's not theirs alone, and they don't have a lot of say in anything. And so their day-to-day life is very different than someone like a musician who would have, a project with a goal in mind, and who knows that, you have to work a little bit at almost every day, if not every day, to get there. So that's a little bit of, I guess, pump up for us as musicians and composers. We work really hard, and I think that it's okay for us to acknowledge that. It is not an easy industry. It's a competitive industry. It's a precarious industry. And we work really hard to get to where we are, whether or not the outside world sees some of those things as successful or not. The other thing that I'd like to say about that is, no matter what, if you believe you are a musician or a composer, you are a musician or a composer. And I say that very definitively because that's what I believe. I've gone through times in my life. Like I said, I went and did a master's outside of music. It took me 15 months. And in those 15 months, I was questioned relentlessly by people as to whether or not I was leaving music. And when I came out of it on the other side, people still questioned whether I was a musician because I was working, 20 hours as an administrator and working for a choir. So was the choir my side job, or was the admin my side job, or how did that work? And I would just tell them, no, I'm a musician. Like, this is how I work. And I think that when we have work outside of the industry, everyone, including our colleagues, sometimes call these things into question. But it shouldn't really matter. At the end of the day, if you're writing a piece and you're putting that out in the world, you're a composer. And if you're playing the piano and you get to concertize for a group of kids at a hospital or in a senior's home or on Carnegie Hall's stage, you're a musician. So I think that this idea of, how do musicians kind of relate to others, and how can we use the skills that we have in other positions, I really truly believe that we have a lot to offer. And there are very smart people in music. And we need to recognize that, because sometimes I feel like there are ideas about what a musician is from within and outside the music industry of, this romanticized idea that, we're by candlelight writing, handwritten things, and, ripping up papers and scratching things out. And, one brilliant composition comes out at the end that's perfect, that's like Mozart level. It's like, that's not really what we are, actually. We work hard. We know what we're doing. We question ourselves. Sometimes we have duds. We have bad days too. But we do work hard, and our work is important. That's another thing. I think composers, it's really important to know that the work you do, that's something you're leaving in the world. That's very, very cool. That's something that will exist forever. And there aren't that many things outside of art that last like that. So again, not trying to pump you up too much, but I do think that we need to give ourselves a little bit of credit.
I was gonna say that's some good tire pumping. I think we actually it's not a terrible thing, because probably all use a little bit more of it, especially nowadays with the business getting as sometimes precarious as it is. This is going to be an interesting transition to the next one, but we've got what some might consider a loaded question from someone. So I'm going to throw to Joseph to ask.
All right, this comes from Quinn. Do universities, colleges have an obligation to offer market relevant degrees, i.e., should traditional performance and composition degrees even exist anymore, considering there are so few jobs in those areas? Or should institutions only offer degrees with ample job opportunities like music tech, music business, and music education?
Loaded question indeed. Thanks, Quinn. I love this question. And, I have my own opinion. We can each have our own opinion. But I do also have research on this question. So my PhD topic is on what we learn in school as music performance students compared to what our reality is, how we operate as musicians once we've graduated, and whether or not that curriculum is relevant to what we do when we come out of music school, for those who aren't familiar with my research. And I am toward the end of my degree. All the data is collected, all of it's analyzed, and I'm in the writing phase. So I do have some statistics and data to back up what I'm talking about. But as always, I'll just say there are lots of biases that come with all of these things. And of course, one of mine is that I have come from the standpoint of having been a music performance student who does not feel that their music school necessarily prepared them for the career that they end up having. So I'll just put that out there to begin with. That's my starting point, is that I undertook this research because I thought that what I did in school did not relate enough to what I ended up doing, and that I had to self-teach and overcome a lot of narratives and ideas that I had had from music school to get to where I am. So all that preface to say, I think that universities do have an obligation not to lie to students about what they're getting themselves into. And I think there's value in the university degrees the way that they are. And I say that meaning no matter what, at the end of the day, if you want to be a musician or a composer, you do have to have the technical and musical skills to achieve that. No matter what, if you come out of music school, if you're given the best opportunity in the world, if you go out there and you can't play your instrument, you will not be hired again. So you do have to have the things that they teach you fundamentally as a musician in any genre. And I think that classical music does prepare you at a very high level for the technical proficiencies that you need to achieve those things. Where I think that they're extremely lacking is in exactly the things that you've described, the ideas of music technology, of production, of music business, of education, and what the reality is of what you will be doing as a musician when you graduate. So I'll give you one very clear example. I've studied 5 major universities from Canada, and the people that I've surveyed are all Canadian music performance graduates. And from that survey and interviewing set, the curriculum that's offered in the 5 degree programs, on average, have 2% or less pedagogy requirements. But over 80% of the people graduating from those schools in music performance end up teaching. So to me, that is a massive mismatch. If you are a performance grad, you are as likely to teach as you are to perform. So if 80% of the curriculum, and it's actually more than that, it's 85% of the curriculum is dedicated to the core music performance theory, history elements, and only 2% is dedicated to teaching, to me, that doesn't really make sense. There's a misalignment there. And in fact, many of the degree programs that I studied had 0 requirements for pedagogy outside of piano students. So I think that they should be more realistic and look at their own data of what graduates are doing and match better those particular aspects of portfolio careers that are most prominent, as well as teaching about portfolio careers. Because I think the things that you've highlighted there, music tech, music business, music education, I think that they're choices that we all make. What is going to make up our portfolio? So for me personally, I didn't like the idea of private teaching the piano. I wasn't really interested in that. And because of that, I pursued other things like arts administration and programming. And that's what I do as quite a significant chunk of my portfolio career now. But if I hadn't had a little taste of that in university, which I happen to have on my own because I was co-president of my faculty music association. So I started doing admin without knowing that that was really a thing in undergrad. But if I hadn't had that experience, I don't think I would have known that I liked it. So I think that the schools need to be more explicit in saying you will have other components. Here are some of the ones that you could explore that do make money, that you could potentially make money in. Take these various courses. Yeah, that's the same way that you got into admin. Take these different courses and see what you like, and then work towards having those as part of your portfolio. For instance, I know a lot of people who really love working in production or recording or sound production. I also know people who really love teaching, and I know people who really love admin. But we all have those pieces in different aspects, right? So I think that the universities need to be paying more attention to the way their grads are working, changing the narrative about what it means to be a musician, and then offering supports toward the realistic careers that we do have. And I don't know what that means because at the moment, course load is very full for musicians in university context. So we can't just add, right? We have to be able to manipulate those pieces. One last thing that I will say, which I think is very applicable to composers and to performers, is that it is also known that out of the performers, the people who come out and do perform in any capacity, it is most typical to perform in 4 or more genres. So the idea of a sole focus on classical music is also unrealistic. So people might come out and perform in music theater. They might perform in a garage band. They might perform orchestrally, and even in an orchestra, you perform pop music, you perform kids concerts, you perform traditional repertoire, you perform new repertoire. And so I think we should be expanding from, classical music only as well. And I even find it very difficult. Again, I'll use the University of Ottawa as an example. It's called the School of Music. It's not really a school of music. It's a school of traditional Western classical music. And I think that some of those things need to be either changed or we need to find a way to integrate them better. It's a very big question. It's kind of the idea of, are we a vocational training or are we a higher level learning? For instance, you could say the same thing about an English degree. Should English degrees exist? I don't know, because at the end of an undergrad in English, I don't know what most of those people are doing, right? That doesn't mean they're teaching English. That means they've studied English literature or like writing, creative writing, those types of things. But that's what university is supposedly meant for, right? Is to go study something, a topic, not necessarily provide a vocational training, meaning that you'll come out with a job at the end. So it is a loaded question.
So loaded. I have so many thoughts. I will just say one anecdote before I put it back to Joseph. When I gave a presentation to staff at SOCAN in the spring, I basically spent like the first 5 or 10 minutes talking about why the word classical music is like basically pointless at this point in time, and how like we've basically cornered ourselves into a terrible marketing position because we all operate and are trained in a field of which we can't actually accurately describe in a way that doesn't conflate us with a bunch of old dead white guys from 1852.
Totally agree.
We could do like a whole other thing on this, which maybe Joseph we should one day. But there is one more question before we move to my next question.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just gonna say we at the CMC we just met all the regional directors and had a beginning of strategic planning topic and conversations. And one of the questions is like, okay, well, so what genre are we? What do we mean when we mean Canadian music? And yeah, there's no good answer, which is funny. We're moving towards multiples. It's Canadian musics, and there are specifics in there, and that it's not one genre. But again, maybe a topic for another day. So this question comes from Elena. What would you say that music graduates can do to fill in the gaps of a music degree and prepare for a professional career, say in composition? I will just jump in and plug my own organization. That one of the first things you could do is either subscribe to the CMC newsletter, join the CLC as well. You can join the CLC not as a professional member. With the CMC, there's a bit of a professional requirement, but it's not a huge barrier to entry. But being part of an organization like this, there's lots of stuff that we do, like this talk, that does kind of fill in these gaps and help you on your career. So I'll do that plug, but then I'll just pass it over to Jenna.
I think that's a perfect plug, though, just to say that I can't say enough about networking. And networking gets a bad rep as a word. But when you think about what our lives are like as musicians, in our undergraduate degrees, in our graduate degrees, and in our early days, it's our friends and colleagues who become either our audience members, our collaborators, our administrators, our grantors, or just supports to us, right? I've continued to play with multiple people who I started playing with in undergrad. I've probably played 100 concerts with some of them at this point. And those formed from my undergrad years. And to build on that idea, and particularly to say in composition, Filling in the gaps, sometimes it's just a matter of finding someone who you look up to, who's a few steps further along than you in their career. Let's say if you're an undergrad, like a professor or someone in between you and a professor level in composition, and inviting them to go for coffee and picking their brain about what they did to get to where they are. And of course, we know that some people, came out of their undergrad and managed to walk into a university job 50 years ago, and that's not something that's going to happen anymore. But there are lots of things that they can tell you that they're doing now that would be things that will help you along the way. And I found in my undergrad and in my early grad years following my undergrad that just asking people for help, and not necessarily like, I need a job, give me a job. No, like, hey, I really like what you do. Would you mind going over coffee with me and talking a little bit more about it and what kind of education you have to get there, who you got to know, how you applied for the job, or how you came up with this idea. I found that those conversations led to a lot of things for me. In fact, some of them did lead to jobs. Or some of them led me to a network of people that I didn't really know before, who then I still to this day ask for other things. So to fill in gaps, I would say definitely try to find those organizations that are operating in the circle that you want to be working in. So as a composer, CMC, Canadian League of Composers, SOCAN, anything that has to do with composition, get involved in those organizations in some way, whether it's as a member, whether it's attending something they're doing, whether it's finding out if they have, like a meet and greet type of sessions, and get to know what their programming is like. Because if they're the ones who are going to be presenting your work, you need to know, what the timelines are for that, what it ends up giving you in terms of compensation, how accurate it is, like that you actually can get those positions. That'll tell you a lot, being involved with those organizations and those people. And oftentimes those people are also composers. If you're really interested in the music field in general, there are a lot of people who are musicians themselves working in those administrative positions, or who have a child who is in that position. It's pretty rare, at least in my experience, that you have someone who's in a music hiring position or granting position who has no relationship to the industry. So those people can help you a lot. The other thing I would say is early on, try, even if it will be very depressing, I'm not going to lie to you, but try to apply to as many things as you possibly can, and then ask for feedback on those things. So let's say you decide you're going to write a grant for the Ontario Arts Council, and you apply and you don't get the grant. Not to worry, 90% of people don't get those grants. That is absolutely normal. I have applied for many grants. I've probably got 1 out of 20 that I've applied for. And that's normal. It's normal. You might never get one. I don't think I've ever received a grant from the Canada Council for the Arts, as an example. It's very normal to have negative results from grants. But a lot of people don't follow up with their granting officer to find out feedback on why they didn't get that grant. And those people, that's their job, is to speak with you. I see Joseph just wrote in here, I facilitate many juries and always provide feedback when asked. I've been asked maybe 1% of the time. So, these people are here to help you with those things, to improve them. And I will tell you, as an example, with the Ontario Arts Council, I applied 3 times for the same grant. First 2 times, unsuccessful. Talked to the officer both times. Third time, successful. I implemented what they told me I needed to change. And I would say that very few people do that. So a lot of times it is just about asking people, asking networks, asking for things. And that can be intimidating. I understand that, but you'll never know if you don't try. I'm a big believer in that.
Yeah, I think we've now dealt with another one of my questions on networking, which is great. I would also just underline one point there, specifically to composition. I know at least one, and well, more artistic directors of ensembles who, if they don't see you showing up to concerts and actively making a point of participating in the community writ large, that is a big knock against you. That will come up in juries, that will come up on feedback. And so, just like there's the stupid quote from the West Wing, which is like history is written by those who show up, and like commissioning projects and work and composition is afforded often to those who show up. So I just that really can't be emphasized enough. So this is an interesting one, which I was not going to ask, Jenna, but you put it in your list of things you wanted to talk about, and so this is a word that like I definitely never heard in music school. Although a composer many years ago wrote an interesting article about this that perhaps I can find and share with everyone. But it's about the concept of like entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurship as it applies to musicians and anyone working in the arts. And I think for various reasons, this is sort of kind of a dirty word in many artistic circles, but that's like probably outdated and counterproductive thinking in the year of our Lord 2024. So like, can you speak to the necessity of anyone working in this field to think about entrepreneurial thinking and incorporate it into their work and their practice?
Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to say about that is that being an entrepreneur does not mean you are Elon Musk. Thank goodness it doesn't mean that. Being an entrepreneur can also be the mom and pop shop on the corner. It can be someone who does a side craft business on their time off from being a government employee. And entrepreneurial thinking is even more broad than that. The word entrepreneur actually comes from the idea of entreprendre, so meaning in French to see and take, to enter and take. And that idea is that an entrepreneur sees an opportunity and seizes it. And I think that musicians absolutely are entrepreneurs. We are entrepreneurs every single day. We're an entrepreneur when we're deciding what we want to describe our composition by a title. We're an entrepreneur when we decide to write to someone to see if we can get a concert on their concert series. We're an entrepreneur when we're writing a grant. And we're entrepreneurial when we decide, hey, I actually think it would be great if I started a new concert series, or if I started a trio. Those are all, a form of business, if you think about it. And I don't mean that in a bad way. When we say business, I think a lot of people think commercial, but that's not necessarily what business is, right? So I like the idea of entrepreneurial thinking for musicians, and I wish that we could do more of it, because I think that it's really about looking at your strengths, looking for ideas and places where you think, hey, I could do something cool there, and then figuring out how to make it happen. And if we were to teach this more in school, I think we would actually have a wider range of things that we could do as musicians. And again, if we're taking on that idea of, a classical musician versus a musician, what the difference is between those, even that type of idea is entrepreneurial, right? So I started a concert series at the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. They had funding for arts and culture programming. Who knew? I just went and asked. And now we do 12 concerts a year there. And those are jobs for musicians. And I think that we could have more of these things in many places, and they're super fulfilling. So it's not just necessarily about, cutthroat, I'm going to be the entrepreneur and replace X person who's currently in that. That's not what it means to me. What it means to me is I'm Jenna, and these are my 3 things that I am really passionate about, and I figured out that I want to put out into the world. And here's why you should, take what I'm selling, if however you want to describe it, and then actually presenting those things. And, entrepreneurs aren't always successful either. There's a lot of stats to say that businesses close within, 2 years of starting, I think over 50%. So again, failure is part of the process. And I think it's important that we recognize that you will not always get what you want, but that if you don't ask, you never will. So being entrepreneurial is about finding opportunities that align with what you want, and then seeking them out and doing them. So I think we can do more of that.
Great. I was going to insert an Elon Musk joke, but I think I'll pass. So there's kind of 2 things I wanted to get to here. You kind of opened the door to the one thing I know you want to talk about that I was struggling to figure out how to work in. But you spoke about, designing a concert series in a new non-traditional concert space. And I think this is an idea that, or concept that, especially pre-pandemic, was becoming a thing, like new music in new spaces. And yes. I wonder, I'm just going to kind of turn it to you and let you wax poetic on it, because I think it's something probably pretty passionate about, and probably is something that a lot of composers don't necessarily think about, and probably has a lot of potential for aggressive
Totally.
expansion, as the
Well,
Joker
and if
said.
Yeah, and again, if you're thinking about a non-traditional way to use your skill set, I mean, being a composer is a really cool thing. And I think you could go into many corporations. I mean, if you look at Danook has done something similar to this, but it's specifically on creativity. But as a composer, like you could go to an organization and say, "Hey, I want to do a workshop with all of your employees. We're going to write a piece together." That would be so cool. And I'm sure they would love it. And they would probably hire you. And if you did 10 of those workshops per year, that's in your field and that makes money. And that's an idea that you're like, you can come up with one workshop and then use it in multiple places. So to me, like that's a non-traditional way to use your skill set as a composer, as an example. But it also extends to things that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the idea of writing jingles or writing for movies or, teaming up with a new music creators program for some sort of project that you're going to do in the future. To me, these are all non-traditional things. And I think new music and composers who are living today really, really go well with this idea of non-traditional spaces because I think that a lot of our general population, what they're interested in is out of the ordinary. When they finish their job as an accountant or as a lawyer or as a doctor, at the end of the day, they want to go see something either creative or something in athletics. That's known, right? Like that's the crux of what makes a really strong society culturally is this idea that we have cool things that we can go do outside of our work life. And as musicians, we're also blessed with the fact that sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes we really love the work that we're doing. And I say not always because I think it's also important that we know, because many people in my family say this to me, oh, you're so lucky you get to do what you love every single day. It's like, well, some days I spend 12 hours writing a grant. And some days I spend 3 hours writing really nasty emails back. No, I don't write nasty emails, but emails back to people, rejecting them from things or excitedly telling them that they get to do something that I don't get to do. And that's not super fun. But I do also get to play the piano, and I do also get to put on amazing projects that I love. And I do get to do these talks and meet new people, and I really enjoy that. So just to say, music is not always fun either. It is hard work sometimes. But this non-traditional space idea, I think, we're beyond the only Carnegie Hall is where music happens phase. That's not what our reality is with the music industry these days. You go to experience really cool piece in an echo chamber of some kind, or a composer comes up with a new idea that interacts with an art installation. These are really interesting and creative things that don't necessarily fit into a traditional concert series that you might have to propose to a granting agency, or you might have to work with an art gallery or a different type of space in order to achieve. But those can be really cool experiences too. And if you have those ideas, know that not everyone does. And so, capitalizing on things that make you different, especially if you're a creative type, I would not assume that everyone can come up with those ideas, is what I would say.
So I want to circle back quickly to networking, because I've been thinking about this a bit recently from an admin perspective, just because we're trying to up our fundraising game, namely. And I had said even like, oh, if you don't go to concerts and show up at concerts and 80s don't see you, then you don't get work. And that's of course like a kind of networking, but that's an insular intra community form of networking because you're connecting with performers and musicians and people kind of in the field. And obviously that's important because that's how you get hired as a performer often. That's how you get hired as a composer, blah, 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 blah. However, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of networking in social circles beyond music, whether it's your friends who are in business school or your friends in medical school, or just sort of hanging around and talking with non-musicians, whether it's a way to bring them in to the world of new music, but also, and this sounds like very vulturistic, I suppose, but as like these are folks working in fields where there is sometimes lots of money floating around and they might work for big companies and they might, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you are looking to sort of move into these other jobs or even even within music, like the importance of connecting to people who aren't just folks you went to your undergrad with
Yeah.
in music.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point. One interesting thing. So I'm actually currently living in Texas this year. I'm in my little apartment in like 25-degree weather in December. I've moved here with my partner for 1 year, and I've had to do lots of changes to my portfolio because of that. But I will say one very interesting thing is he's working at a hospital, and I found out that that hospital has 3 different types of concert series, and that's because the oil industry here funds all of them. Now, some people might look at that and say, like, ooh, I don't really like that idea. But you know what? They literally bring the Houston Symphony to the hospital 3 times a year to perform concerts, and they pay for it. And that's just to say that there are industries where there is money and where people want those things to be happening. One example that I would give besides Texas is, if you are um, if you're in a group of friends, let's say you're out to brunch for someone's birthday and their friend is from a totally different industry and you're a composer, and they find out they've just met you for the first time and they find out that you're a composer and they say, oh, cool, that's amazing. Like, how do you work? Just know that people have no idea what you do, outside of your field. And there are things that if they did know, maybe they would support you. So as an example, we met someone at Chamberfest. It was a friend of a friend who had come to a concert, and they happened to be there on a day where from the stage we announced that we were doing commissioning projects. They had no idea that this was something that people did, that you could put money towards someone creating a new piece for you. They literally did not know that this was how, composers worked. And they said, like, well, how much money are we talking about? Is it like $10,000? It's like, sure, it could be $10,000. That would be great. But it could also be 3 different people providing $500. Or it could be 10 people providing $1,000. And projects can be tailor made, right? So if at that table that you're sitting at for brunch, somebody says, oh, that's so cool, you're a composer, like, what do you do? You can say, well, I work at with the CMC. I write music for chamber groups. I teach composition, and I also, accept commissions where people who want a piece written, and either they give me free rein on what that piece is, what instrumentation, how long, etc., or they give me a parameter based on, guidelines of how artists work. There's a kind of a minimum per minute for different things. Like, you can explain these things to them, and they will find it interesting. So I do think that there's something to be said for networking outside of our little bubble, where we all kind of know how it works and kind of don't know how it works. And because of that, we all feel like, oh, well, it's kind of annoying, like to talk about grants or to talk about whatever else. But I will tell you, many times you will be the most interesting person in the room, as that person, as that composer, or as that cellist, or whatever it is that you do. And that people, when they learn about what you do, it's a form of education and a form of supporting yourself, because, they might also say, and this has happened to me before, hey, I would love to go see a concert like that. I didn't know we did stuff like that in Ottawa. Can you like send me something on Instagram when you're performing next? Great, new audience member. Or, wow, that's so cool. My mom is a huge fan of choral music. Maybe I'll commission you for something for her 40th wedding anniversary that's coming up. I'm not going to say whether or not that's a good thing to do things for birthdays or whatever else as a composer, but you see where I'm getting with this. Our network does go beyond just musicians, but also musicians are a really good form of social networking and finding work too. So don't be afraid of talking about what you do, I guess is what I'm trying to say. When we talk about networking, it's not just, hi, I'm so-and-so and I'm a composer. It's, hey, like, are you interested in this thing? Because this is what I end up doing. And explaining it a little bit more. And for me personally, I find the portfolio career thing is a great tool to be able to explain what I do in those situations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, I think that's something, Joseph, we've talked about organizing in the future is some sort of networking help training. Because I think a lot of musicians are naturally a bit socially awkward and we're really terrified of doing that, but it's not as scary as it seems. So I'm kind of getting the wrap up vibe from Joseph because I know it's a busy day of meetings at the CMC. So, if anyone, I know we've been answering questions as we go. If anyone does have any like final pressing questions, You can drop them in the chat, or I'm also thinking that if there's something that wasn't covered, or you've got questions, Jenna just put her email there. If you've got another question that you want to answer, like you can either reach out to Joseph or I, and we'll pass it on to Jenna. Or Jenna, if you're comfortable, as I've seen you just shared 2 email
Totally.
addresses, people can maybe get in touch with you as well. Because I think
And
this
I'm
is
one of
like
those people who's happy to, have a coffee from Texas with you too. If there are, things that are more specific about your current setup that you'd want to talk through, I'm not a career coach, but I'm happy to speak with people who are trying to make it in our industry because it is tough.
awesome. That's really generous of you, and I highly encourage folks to take you up on that, because you've got a lot of things to say about this, and I feel like we just sort of kind of scratched the surface. So with that, I can see Joseph is giving me a bit of the eye. So thank you, Jenna, so much for your time and for your sharing your expertise. If you could shoot me your research when you're done with it, I'd be fascinated to take a look at it and some of the statistics, and maybe we can help disseminate that amongst some of our community members, because they might find it useful. And thank you everyone for showing up on this Thursday afternoon. And I hope you all have a great holidays, and keep your eye out. Probably early January, we will get back to programming these. And I'm not exactly sure what's going to be first up in the new year, but we will have more of these workshops in 2025.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Joseph.
See you.
Thank you, everyone.